Hello, Reliable Web Summit. My name is Owen Buckley, and I'm really excited today to be sharing with you my talk titled Knowing Your TCO, known as Total Cost of Ownership. A little bit about myself. I'm an independent open source developer. I was previously principal UI architect at Clarivate. I'm a huge fan of the web and JavaScript and web standards and all things like that. If you're interested just to get a glance of what I'm up to, feel free to check out GitHub or Twitter or either of those. For my talk today, I'd like to walk us through a few topics related to the main title at hand. Just my way of kind of framing the conversation here and hopefully providing some useful food for thought for all of you to carry through after the presentation is over. So first, just to set a frame of reference for everybody, in case you're not familiar with the term total cost of ownership, as the definition states, it's effectively the overall cost of acquiring or possessing a good, be it digital or physical. Commonly, we might assume, we might only think about the purchase price. For instance, if we're getting a car or getting a house, sure, there's the sticker price, but for anybody that's owned either of those or any other kind of big ticket items like that, certainly with a car, you know that, well, there's operating expenses like gas and changing the oil and rotating the tires, just the wear and tear, the normal maintenance. But inevitably, things will fall apart. You'll have to replace the transmission or something more fundamental like the radiator might break. And so this is where this concept of total cost of ownership comes into play, in that for the sake of this conversation, as we apply it to software, it's especially in the context of open source where maybe there is no purchase price at all, doesn't mean there's no cost. We might benefit from a lower overall cost because of that initial freeness up front. But I think, as many of us have found, sometimes that does come back to haunt us a little bit. Some examples that you may or may not be familiar with. This was from a few years ago, but the infamous left pad incident. This was earlier in maybe NPM's history, but effectively a maintainer was able to remove a bunch of packages that they owned, which inevitably led to a lot of breakages. These packages weren't necessarily the most popular in terms of awareness on NPM, but because of their inclusion in other packages, they caused these very hard to find and kind of downstream impacts to users of maybe higher level software. Another example more recently was the event stream incident, wherein transfership of a package, less known or transitive package, was conducted, and that allowed the new owner to sneak into some malicious code that eventually started to spread across the JavaScript community. And so both of these instances are what they refer to as a supply chain attack, and it's not exclusive to NPM, but it's certainly, again, kind of part of the cost of doing business, or certainly something that needs to be factored in past that initial NPM install. And even if it's not a supply chain attack, it could just be the proliferation of JavaScript to just be used to write everything. So much so that stable, familiar languages of HTML and CSS might not necessarily be at the forefront of the development of maybe more static sites, for example. And so now this additional convenience to developers is start to tip away from the intent of making better user experiences. So all in all, the through line here is that while something in this case like open source may be free, quote unquote free up front, doesn't necessarily mean there isn't an incurred over time cost that comes with managing and maintaining dependencies, let alone the code if you manage and maintain them yourselves, but just keeping your local development environment stable or your continuous integration environment stable. Semver is great in theory, but doesn't necessarily mean everybody respects it. I'm sure more than one of us have experienced some sort of breaking change within a minor release. So a lot of this comes down to the honor system, which is, again, maybe part of the course for open source, but we're still responsible for the decisions that we make for technology, for ourselves and for others. And so, this is kind of the higher level point that I hope to convey in this talk. So, and kind of align it with some of that concept of total cost of ownership. Another way to think about it is assets and liabilities. Although these tools might provide you an asset in terms of speed or productivity boosts, potentially below the surface there in your node modules, there just might be something lurking. So anyway, just to kind of frame the topic for the rest of the sections. So hopefully that's helpful for those who may be new to JavaScript or were not familiar with the term total cost of ownership. So to kick things off, I'd like to start with an analogy, one that I refer to as the inverse iceberg. So the inspiration for this talk wasn't necessarily those articles and those instances I cited before. We've been dealing with them for a little while now in JavaScript, certainly the breaking changes, but I stumbled upon this Twitter thread. I haven't linked to the whole thing just because Twitter is Twitter, but within this conversation that started off as a sort of evaluation of what frameworks give you versus non-frameworks and the relative merit and value of those advantages. In this thread, there's a really good conversation about the level of effort of tooling that needs to go into modern day web development. And so what I got out of this thread was really this question that I more bluntly asked myself, or more literally asked is, not literally, but figuratively is, why even have tooling? When is it enough? Right? At what point for the tasks that we're working on, maybe we are using too much of these tools, or that we just reach for the same thing over and over and over, regardless of whether it's justified for the given use case. And I don't think I could blame any of us, or any of us could certainly feel that we're not necessarily, inundated with options across the ecosystem. Consuming and producing and contributing to code has never been easier, and it's great. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of inspiration. But I think, unfortunately, there's also a lot of maybe marketing that comes with that because of that ease of access. I think there's very much a sense of redefining or reappropriating what modern web development means today. A lot of it, I think, really tries to justify the overuse of JavaScript to literally write anything, but that the trade-off will be worth it because it's going to make for a better user experience. And it's just funny to think that a lot of times when what you want to ship or produce is just HTML and just HTML or even CSS, that you have to write a whole bunch of JavaScript just to get there, regardless of maybe even to get shipped or not. It's just curious that, it's JavaScript feels like it's becoming the de facto entry and authoring point for the web, for better or worse. Potentially worse. And so that brings us to the analogy of the iceberg. So if you're not familiar, the idiom, the tip of the iceberg, refers to the perspective of ship captains on the ocean who would see an iceberg but would only see the tip. And what they couldn't as easily see or gauge or understand is what lay beneath the surface. Was the rest of this iceberg huge, like we see here, overwhelmingly disproportionate to just the visible part? Or was what you saw what you got? And so this really, as I was thinking about this thread and thinking about the Twitter thread and thinking about the conversation that I was having with myself about this balance of, table stakes, development tools and workflows, it helped me start to gain a frame of reference about just maybe how I felt about node modules over these years. And so inevitably I landed on this analogy of, comparing node modules to an iceberg where you get a lot up top, but maybe not, but what's beneath is so mysterious and murky. If something were to happen, how effective would you be at understanding how to fix it? Unlike a car, you might not have a warranty or a dealership to fall back on if something happens. And so to complement this idea of the iceberg, the traditional iceberg, with potentially a much bigger surface area below than above, I started to think about, well, what if you've kind of flipped that script and instead you took more control and ownership of the above ground portion to minimize the risk of what's below the surface? Effectively doing your own oil change or potentially rotating your own tires. Of course, it does maybe require a bit more of a technical investment and it might look a bit intimidating because as you come across this iceberg, you're like, wow, look at that thing. It's huge. There's just so much out in the open. It must be massive underneath, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Traditionally, most icebergs are pretty big below the surface, but going back to that perspective of intentionality, if you move into a intentional set of decision making where maybe you take more ownership of the code and dependencies that you choose not to use or implement yourself, yes, it might look, or you might own a bigger chunk above the surface, but it's what it's what you put there. It's what you've chosen to prescribe ownership to. And I think to me, that really resonated, kind of flipping the script and saying, well, if it's going to be there, it might as well be above the surface where I can see it, where I know exactly what's there, where the sunlight is shining on it. And I had the choice as to whether it went there or not. It's not some mysterious mass below the water that I can't see, and I don't know how to navigate around it or how wide to navigate or anything like that. So this is the inverse iceberg that I refer to. So to kind of carry this theme forward a little bit and how to apply front-end software development and technology to this concept of the iceberg, I'd like to get into the next section. I've been starting to refer kind of this conversation around as technical accounting. And so really for me, what I have tried to use this concept for is to define what the tip of the iceberg is and to make these intentional choices and ask these intentional questions during the projects that I work on. I've noticed that the more I've tried to scale back my use of tooling and additional libraries and frameworks to complete the job, I noticed the lag. Like if I go from just straight vanilla HTML, CSS to JavaScript, and I throw in a TypeScript compiler in the mix, like I start to recognize that bit of delay in, say, refreshing the browser and waiting for TypeScript to parse. It's interesting to me that when you kind of scale back and incrementally adopt technology, I think you start to get a much better sense and appreciation for what the incremental costs are, not just things breaking, but the time to set them up, the time to wait for things to refresh. To me, those are all parts of the owner's manual, if you will, whether it's advertised or explicitly stated on the box or not. It's still part of the equation, whether the marketing website, makes that clear or not. So yeah, I've been really just trying to frame it as, again, trying to surface more of the complexity and the technicality of these projects as I pick and choose them, and make it more apparent what's above the water and really try and minimize what's below the water. Because looks can also be deceiving, much like these icebergs. In fact, you could even look at a package JSON and maybe you just see one package in there, but maybe that package is a framework, or maybe it's a meta framework. So it's packing in frameworks of frameworks underneath itself, right? And so what might appear to be maybe a simple CLI at the top masks a significant amount of complexity below the surface. And so kind of to call back to our previous section, another way to think about it is asset up top, but liability below. And if we're thinking about the inverse iceberg, if we're flipping the script, we might have more assets above to manage, but the liability shrinks as a result. As our iceberg rises above the water, we're reducing the uncertainty in what we don't know below the surface and bringing it above the surface where we can see it and have more ownership and accountability to it. And I think a question that a lot of us, as I've posed to myself, could be asking ourselves is, am I picking what's easiest for the user or for me? Am I picking these? I mean, they might be fun to work with, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that, what we've been spoiled with these days are bad by any stretch of the imagination. There's obviously use cases for these things. I think the question is it, I'm just picking it because it's what I know, what I'm used to, regardless of the context that I'm applying it to. It doesn't count for like training and learning. I mean, you have to have an outlet to try new things, but the repeated mantra of JavaScript, all the things, just doesn't seem appropriate given all the different types of projects that we're working on. And so, yeah, I think there's a worthwhile discussion to be had with ourselves first and foremost about, why am I picking this tool specifically, and who is it really for? And ultimately, it's going to be a balance. Your project, your skills, your understanding of the outcomes, those all have to be taken into effect. So the local decision making will still come down to you. But I hope that through this conversation, we can get a better appreciation for what I think needs to be this balance between technology and productivity. And so that to me is where this stage, this phase of technical accounting comes in, where you weighing the pros and cons and the benefits and measuring your above and below the surface assets and liabilities, and ultimately trying to come to an understanding of decision making that is comfortable, not only known and transparent, not only for yourself, but for your users or your customers or your managers or your clients, whatever it may be. As technologists, we're in this position to make these decisions, and so it's incumbent upon us to really be context minded at all points and really make sure that we're picking the best tool for the job. So how do we go about this, or is there a kind of a methodology to this? So I think so. I mean, I think in general, kind of the where I ended my kind of thought process on this topic in general was under the was thinking about developer experience as a spectrum. So if you think about the above and below the surface of the iceberg, to me you could think of it as a spectrum in terms of, well, what is minimum for development nowadays versus kind of what's nice to have, the needs versus the wants, if you will. Because let's face it, there's a lot to pick out there. A lot of frameworks, a lot of tools, a lot of options, and they certainly have their use cases. I think the challenge or kind of the observation is, these are all used all the time, maybe whether it's warranted or not. And so that's, so kind of carrying through from this Twitter thread, that's got me thinking, is there this minimum level of developer experience that we can all agree to should kind of just be table stakes? For instance, would anybody argue that live reload as you're developing is a nice to have? I would argue it's fairly must have, in the sense that it's fairly low risk because it's not a all-consuming part of your workflow, like say a framework might be, where if a framework stops working or breaks, it could potentially stop all your development. If a live reload server breaks, you click refresh. It might be annoying for a day or two, but you're probably not going to, or your team's maybe not going to be completely halted because the CI server broke for some sort of version mismatch dependency. So I think that this is really where a lot of the conversation can happen, hopefully in the chat or the Q&A. It's just from this prior list, kind of can personally or professionally, can you kind of plot where these tools and technologies fit kind of in your own like one-dimensional technology radar, your own iceberg, and can you kind of balance the scales yourself and come to terms with that and ultimately own the repercussions of those decisions as well. right? Because, well, like I said, your framework might just add one or two entries to your package JSON. What you see in node modules can be a much different story. And so for comparison, I've kind of given an example of kind of where some of my choices are at these days. I've been moving more and more, and this is mainly due to the continued improvement and progression and power of the browser platform to provide these tools and techniques that, yeah, before, and I think this is a good point, for a time, we maybe didn't have as many options, or we didn't have options to maybe go bundleless versus not, because maybe something like import map wasn't available in the browser. But I'd say the proliferation of these tools and technologies is not limited to just Node.js and NPM, but the browser, in my opinion, is really bringing it these days. And so, yes, I am maybe writing a little more code and maybe not delegating a framework for as many things. I feel more confident because I enjoy writing code and knowing, having a better sense of my personal total cost of ownership, because if something goes wrong or something breaks, or I need to look something up, in my case, a lot of what I can do all my research on is just MDN. I only need to go to the MDN docs to look up how things work. I don't have to worry about third-party manuals and documentation. Now, still, I can't write everything. So, of course, you'll see things like Node.js, and I use Mocha for testing and ESLint for linting. And so, it's not about an extreme in either direction. Above or below, it's not about having nothing. I mean, I'm not to the point where you have to write your own compiler and assembler. It's just being more conscious of the decisions that we're making about when we reach for these things over and over, in particular in scenarios where, if you're just writing some HTML, a lot of what was on that previous list might be a little bit overkill. So anyway, just to kind of put it into perspective, just kind of where I'm coming from, if I was to take some of those technologies and plot them. So in kind of to close this out a little bit, to kind of bring it back full circle and knowing your TCO, I definitely recognize that, some of these are just maybe common sense, but I think that we're always in a position to be asking ourselves these questions, at least when we start a new project, just make sure that we're working backwards from the problem we're trying to solve. I also believe that constraints can be good. And I think most times, if your project ever does need to scale or get larger, or starts to benefit maybe from a framework or library, I think you'll be in a better position to upscale if you've just only adopted the minimum technical investment you need to achieve the exact current outcome that you want. There's a lot of, in my experience, I've seen a lot of cases where we try and predict what the future might hold for the product or the technology. We're making decisions, based on assumptions that may never come true. The product team may never get to that point. They might abandon the project, right? And so all that work might have been for naught. And so, just to kind of tie it all together, I don't think you can really go wrong if you always make sure you work backwards from the problem you're trying to solve, and just balance the scales along the way and arrive at the right iceberg for the project that you're working on. So in closing, I just want to reiterate, this isn't necessarily intended to be picking winners and losers. I only gave an example of some of the technologies and the tools that I've been using over the past year or two, exploring my personal projects to eventually mature into professional projects. And I can honestly say I've gained a lot of satisfaction, learned a lot more, and got a lot more intimate with the web. And I think it's a really good opportunity for all of us to just pause and explore our relationship with technology and productivity, both short-term and long-term, and really making sure that we're making decisions that are going to benefit the beneficiaries of our work. So instead of picking the most convenient option for us, it's really about, well, what does the client really need? What do their users really need? You know, when I'm not here and my client is working on this by themselves, you know, are they going to need another consultant later on to make a quick fix because there's a typo in the copy text or an image is broken? You know, that especially when you think about it after maybe the project's done and now that you're not in the weeds, in the depth of all the tooling, and now you just want to come back and just make a quick change, you know, rebuilding all that apparatus to make a one-line change. You know, if you're not in the thick of it already, it, you know, adds a lot of friction. So I think it's just important to really, again, take this whole understanding of ownership, especially since we are so spoiled these days to not really have to pay for a lot of the software that we use, but doesn't necessarily mean it's free for life. And I hope that through this, I didn't give any impression that this doesn't mean it has to take the fun out of programming. I know there's lots of great tools and technologies out there, and again, they do have their use cases. I think the phrase that comes to mind is when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, is somewhat apt. But I hope that hopefully this talk started to give you some things to think about for your own projects, for your next projects. If you're interested in any of the tools that I mentioned in my stack, or you've just been trying to explore ways to reduce your own risks and dependencies on the plethora of libraries and technologies out there, then I would definitely encourage you to come and check out some of the projects that I've been working on, Greenwood.js and the Project Evergreen GitHub org in particular, really helping, in my mind, to reacquaint us all with I think at least for myself, what I fell in love with web development was just being able to be productive and writing the code I need to get the results I need, but still with some of the modern conveniences like live reload and you know, being able to work within things like within systems like design systems and stuff like that. So it doesn't have to be boring or constricting to own more above the water. You know, it maybe requires being a little more hands-on, but I think that's at least for myself as a technologist, I consider that to be par for the course in terms of me being a responsible representative for my clients and employers. So to close out, here's the link to get access to these slides and all the other links and references that I provided. And just wanted to say thank you again, Reliable Web Summit, and all the new friends I hope to make in the chat and the Q&A. It was great to present here today, and looking forward to catching up with you all after the talk. So thanks. Bye. Talk to you soon.
Hey, it's Joe Eames with ng-conf. If you like that video, be sure to click subscribe either here or here, somewhere over here. And if you're looking for something more, here's another video for you to watch here or there or somewhere.